Sabi ko talaga may kulang. Pasensya na guys, medyo jet lag pa rin. Sisisiin nyo yung Philippine Airlines. Kahapon ko pa. Grabe.
Mukhang bati na kayo Mukhang bati na
eh.
kayo ng PAL
Yeah, ano lang, just being nice. Anyway, let's talk more about it. Kasi, no, I mean, again, thank you so much, Teddy Casino, for joining us. No, we were talking about why you became an activist, and as an activist, as a scholar, as a historian, etc. How you understood where we went wrong with the EDSA revolution, because I think all of us can agree that the EDSA revolution indeed represented the best aspirations of the Philippines to become a truly more progressive country, to be a genuine democracy we never were. And so I would say historically it was a continuation of what the Rizal generations wanted to do back in the 19th century. Obviously, in the late 19th century, hindi pa sila, like their idea of freedom was nowhere close to the more progressive version we have in contemporary times. But in fairness, naman, I think there is a continuity between what Rizal wanted to get kick-started, what Bonifacio wanted to get kick-started in the late 19th century, and then what Ninoy and others, including people from across the ideological spectrum, were fighting for. So I think we kind of agree on the fact that EDSA was not just a coup, or it was not just a civilian-backed coup, but it just happened that there was a coup defection within the elite that triggered a broader wave, which toppled the Marcos regime. Now, the bone of contention, of course, here, Teddy, is saan tayo nagkamali? Where did things go wrong? And what you're arguing, which I think a lot of historians will actually agree with you, is that because we had a problematic civil-military relation setup, essentially Corazon Aquino did not control the military, and Corazon Aquino was not Ninoy. She was not a natural politician. That weakness, meaning lack of professional control or institutionalized control on the military, allowed the more right-wing reactionary elements. I think the term reactionary is very important, right? The media, the mainstream media doesn't use that term, but I think reactionary is the perfect way of putting it. The reactionary element constantly bullied Corazon Aquino to drop the more progressive voices from the transition process in the 1980s. And from then on, essentially, we are in a downward spiral, in one way or another. Am I right to put it that way? Is that a fair summary of
It's very
I'm really sorry for compressing that. Yeah.
I think that was a very accurate summation of what happened. Ang isang aspeto diyan makikita mo yung the military was never held accountable for the violations of human rights during martial law. Ito yung, if you look at other countries, ito yung first on the agenda of any transition government, to give justice to the victims of human rights. Hindi nangyari sa Pilipinas yan. And that was yan yung isang ikinasasama ng loob ng marami naging victims ng martial law. It took how many decades before the government, through legislation, actually acknowledged the violations of the systematic violations of human rights under martial law. Doon pa lang makikita mo na how powerful the military was at that point. I think it was the single institution that was preserved after martial law. Hindi nagalaw yan. And so yeah, you're exactly right.
Yeah.
Nagbago lang yung pangalan from PC ginawang INP at PNP. But I think down the line, the generals, everything was left intact. Kasi nga, bumaliktad sila at the last minute.
Yeah. Also, of course, I mean, in fairness naman, we did not also see as much accountability in many Latin American countries at the beginning, right? In so-called pacted transitions, if whether you look at Chile, Argentina, Brazil is a very, I think, similar case to the Philippines, where a lot of their dictatorship era generals are just, just walking around, and a lot of them actually were inspiration or even perhaps backed the former Brazilian president, the Trump of the tropics, Bolsonaro. So I think, in fairness naman to the Philippines, the mistake was not very unique to us. But I also agree with you that at least in cases like Chile and to a lesser degree in Argentina, we saw there was movement towards getting more accountability. I mean, Pinochet eventually somehow got his piece of justice, right? In the case of Chile.
Well, we had PCGG,
right?
Pero PCGG was basically after the Marcos loot, the cronies. Right. The CHR was supposed to, one of the mechanisms, pero hindi rin ang daming proposals noon for a truth commission, etc. Hindi naman nangyari. So other countries also did. Hindi kasi madaling trabaho yan eh.
Right.
Accountability for those kinds of violations. But at least in other countries, medyo mas makita mo, mas may effort at mas may institutional effort talaga. Sa Pilipinas, because of the very strong role of Enrile and Donasan and Ramos in the post-Marcos era, hindi nangyari yan.
Right. And that, of course, created the path dependency, no, of long-term institutional compromise, no? I would also want to emphasize na based on sa ibang podcasts namin with Attorney Carranza, Attorney Jokno, among others, one of the things that they also emphasize is what you can also term as the judicial deep state in the Philippines, no? I mean, because you cannot get accountability, right? I mean, I think what we had was half-truth and non-reconciliation, right? Despite the best efforts of Attorney Carranza, many other great people who tried to push for accountability. And one culprit, many would argue, that is the fact that many Marcos era judges, judicial figures, essentially, continued business as usual. It's not like just business as usual for pre-Marcos era, but a lot of Marcos era people just were sticking around. And in many ways, that may explain why the Marcoses got back so seamlessly, right? And by 1992, tumatakbo na si Imelda. Kung nagsama sila ni Danding, di nabalik na sila sa Malacanang.
Correct. Imagine that.
1992, dapat tapos na.
Kaya nga hilaw eh. Hilaw talaga yung revolution eh. Doon mo masasabing it wasn't really a revolution. There was a revolutionary government, but I think it wasn't revolutionary enough. In some countries, clean slate yan. Tanggal lahat yan. Iba nga, talagang pinapatay eh. They're lined up against the wall and killed, But hindi nangyari dito sa atin. Yan. And we, always want to say, na hindi, peaceful kasi yung ating revolution, etc. But it came to the point na yung justice nabura in this effort to be reconciliatory, na ayusin na natin lahat. Hindi pwedeng ganun eh.
Yeah, for me kasi, I'm all for the peaceful revolution part, but you had peaceful revolution in Spain, in Portugal, and then later, of course, in Eastern Europe. And I think they have done far better than us in bringing a certain degree of truth and reconciliation. I would even point out yung mga neighbors natin, because Taiwan and South Korea also had a transition to democracy more or less the same time. These are all in the mid or late 1980s, no? And I think all of them have done far better than the Philippines, no? So I think Brazil will kind of make us look okay, but I can point at Taiwan, at Portugal, at South Korea, all of them, no? They went from very brutal dictatorship, whether it's Park Chung-hee and the successor dictatorship in Korea, or the Chiang Kai-shek, dictatorship in Taiwan, and it's all of them did better than us. Kaya part of me is wondering, was that lack of imagination or what lack of political will? Like, because I hate the cultural arguments, no? Because I think cultural arguments are the lazy answers, right? Kasi Filipino, madali tayo magpatawa. Ang Pilipino, ganyan. Like, I don't like those answers, Teddy, because if ganon, di wala, no?
Yeah.
Case na pala. I don't believe in that, because a lot of our neighbors were also had trapos in power. A lot of countries around the world were where we are today. It's not like uniquely miserable or problematic in Philippines, no. And I think the Philippines has done also well in certain ways that puts us ahead of a lot of other countries. So I don't like those cultural arguments. Ang Pinoy kasi makalimot. Like, no, I don't buy. My sense is there were certain leadership deficits. There were also certain
leadership deficits,
mistakes, and also certain institutional curse na hindi naayos, if I can put it that way, no? Yung lack of rule of law and judicial independence, a lot of this issue, and civil-military relations professionalization, a lot of those problems. Some would argue that have not been fully overcome or yet to be fully overcome. But one thing I want to ask also, Teddy, here, don't worry, as I said, this is conversation, so you don't have to, answer everything I'm throwing out there. Another thing I would want to ask, Teddy, I don't want to put you on the spot necessarily on this, but ang thing is, for me, okay, I understand the shortcomings of the center or the liberals, right? We clearly have identified that the far right or alt-right, whatever you want to call them, clearly were systematic in their effort in undermining the more progressive potential of the EDSA revolution. But ano naman yung kakulangan sa tingin mo ng left or so-called left or the umbrella left? Because of course, it's also very diverse, right? It's not like one group or one person. But if there's any shortcoming on the part of lefts, saan sa tingin mo? Is it lack of reaching out to the ordinary people? Is it not winning the hearts of minds of people as much? Is it not mobilizing or fighting the public, the PR fight? I mean, because politics is also PR, right? Saan kaya nagkakulang? And what are the lessons also from those era? Again, in light of all the structural disadvantages of the left in the Philippines, still in the Cold War period. So we're trying to be fair here. Given all the structural disadvantage, saan naman siguro sa tingin mo nagkakaroon ng tactical and strategic mistakes?
I think the left has always been candid and honest about their errors. The failure to participate strongly in the snap elections, I think, was identified as a strategic error. And then after that, the purges and the internal, ang in-identify nila dyan in terms of strategy, masyado silang nagmadali. So medyo masyado nilang pinainit yung urban military operations. Now, we're talking about the left in general, to include both those in the legal parliamentary struggle and those in the armed underground struggle. Ang tawag nila dyan yung regularization, no? And veering away from the established strategy and tactics that they identified in the 70s, resulting in, among others, the purges and the mistakes. No? So may left and right mistakes naman palagi yung left. Pero yun nga it's both internal and external. Yung external has always been the dominance really of the reactionary regime, no? And the very anti-left and reactionary agenda of those who were in power. And of course, kontrolado naman nila lahat. Kontrolado nila media.
Demonization of the left. Yeah, the demonization of the left.
Yeah, the demonization. And that has been ongoing for how many decades now? So talagang it's an uphill climb for the left. And yeah, the fact that the left has survived until now, I think is in itself an achievement. Diba? Sa ibang bansa, halos wala nang,
wala. I mean,
wala nang vestige ng left.
In Indonesia, right? Literally, there was a, genocidal. I mean, I'm still traumatized dun sa because I have a new book coming out on, ASEAN, Southeast Asian countries and, relations with China. And the Indonesia chapter for me was the most traumatic when I was doing the research. Yung movie ni Oppenheimer, diba? About, interviewing yung mga tao involved in the massacre of suspected communists and people aligned to Sukarno and all of that. That was like, it's just crazy. And then, of course, you had the Malaysian emergency. Grabe yung nangyari even in Thailand. So
Thailand,
the Philippines, you would say that, in fairness naman, the left progressive.
Nabuhay.
I mean, still, it's a force. I mean,
force to reckon with. Yeah,
exactly. I mean, it's and once in a while pulls off some magic, right? Now going back to this, what were the critical junctures naman in the past, let's say at least 15-20 years, in a sense that, well, Ramos, I understand it will be hard because Ramos comes from the military and all of that, but didn't Arroyo and Aquino provide some room for a kind of a more progressive lurch, right? Arroyo, especially before the Hello Garcia Arroyo, because she was the beneficiary of EDSA Dos, right? So essentially, wasn't EDSA Dos a chance to correct the shortcomings of EDSA 1?
Yeah.
And I would say Aquino's Daan Matuwid was, again, we all know the criticisms and all of that. I mean, of course, we're not here to, we already operate from the, from the assumption of, let's be realistic about what were the shortcomings of the Aquino administration. But to be fair, didn't EDSA Dos and early Arroyo years, and also the early years of Daan Matuwid of Aquino, didn't they provide at least a new chance, a fresh chance to get some of the things that went wrong right?
Yeah.
We can blame the people in the 1980s and 90s, but it's not like there was no 3 decades to fix some of this, right? Ayoko rin yung masyadong blame lang natin lahat sa 1980s, 1970s, 1990s. may chance din
Yeah.
naman tayo over the past 20 years, right? I mean, that's what I'm saying, yeah.
That's true. In kay Arroyo, not the first years, the first months or probably the first weeks were
Yeah.
good.
To be
The
brutal.
first few weeks. Kasi, magkakasama kami sa EDSA dos niyan eh.
Correct.
And may usapan talaga kay Gloria no na kapag ikaw na yung nasa poder, ito yung mga reforma na kailangan natin gawin, no?
Right.
And like any politician, she said yes. We had several events na nandun si Gloria when she was still vice president.
Exactly.
So nung nasipa si Estrada, in fact, people were asking us in the left, sa bayan, kasi we figured prominently during EDSA 2. Sabi sa amin, hindi ba kayo inofera ng posisyon? And at that time, hindi namin masyadong iniisip yon.
Right.
Hindi namin alam, nagbabalyahan na pala yung iba't ibang mga political forces in that people power coalition. Nagpepwestuhan na pala. Kami, parang ang habol namin, ano na yung sasabihin natin kay Gloria, ano na yung isisingil nating policies kay Gloria, while other forces were jostling for the positions. Eventually, we found ourselves, parang sideline na naman tayo dito.
Parang exactly, parang nangyari ulit yung nangyari kay Corazon Aquino, no? To a certain degree, right?
Yes. So maaga yon, I think by July,
Right.
medyo nagkakabardagulan na kami ng gobyerno ni Gloria noon. And then the peace talks was also very short-lived. Eventually, wala naman siyang kaseryosohan. And then the killing started. Yung, I think that late 2002, mid 2003, nag-start na dyan yung sila Palparan, and these killings and abductions, more than 1,000 yan. And then you had Aston coming here, you had the Melo report. So talagang very short-lived yung opening during the time of Arroyo. During the time of Noynoy, we were actually part of the majority in Congress. I got a committee chairmanship at that time. I was made chairman of the Committee on Small Business Entrepreneurship Development. Pero syempre, ang kandidato namin noon, hindi naman si Noynoy. Si Villar ang sinuportahan namin noon.
Hindi si Cynthia, si Manny to.
Hindi, si Manny.
Sa mga nakalimutan.
Yeah. Pero ang nangyari din doon, medyo Noynoy was close siya sa idea na magkakaroon ng cooperation eh. Hindi naka first base ang peace process diyan. And nung lumabas na magpapatuloy din yung yung pork barrel and all the reforms that, kasi daang matuwid yun eh. So ang inisip namin, daang matuwid. Siguro yung pork barrel, kung hindi man matatanggal, siguro mababawasan.
Right.
Nangyari, lumaki pa. And then you had DAP. And then, so hindi rin namin kinakitaan ng any meaningful level of cooperation.
And because
so
also
by the midterm, medyo nasa opposition na talaga kaming in Congress.
And just to be fair, I mean, President Aquino was also closer to the rejectionist wing of the left, right? Particularly the
I'm not so sure if he was close, but he was close more to the SOCDEMs. Yung
SOCDEMs, yeah, of course. Yeah.
The SOCDEMs. Pero yun, so wala rin naging and then ang daming policy differences.
Right.
Diyan napapasok yung EDCA, diyan so
we'll discuss very shortly. But before going to the EDCA issue, because I think that's very important in its own right. What happened with Duterte? Because I don't know how to put it. The contention, the argument, the claim, whatever, is that there was a temporary kind of alliance or blending of minds between people in the left and Duterte, because Duterte himself, positioned himself as a kind of a semi-revolutionary, a socialist. Yeah, he called himself. He said, "I'm not a communist, but I'm a socialist." And I don't know. I wrote a book on Duterte, so I had to research a lot about him, talk to friends in etc. And they would say, kung na-meet mo si Digong nung 40-year-old, 50, mas bata pa siya, he would talk dialectics, Marxist dialectics. Like makulit daw talaga yun. He can talk about historical materialism, etc. Sabi niya, don't look at him now na, well, he can barely, we know it's the problem, right? They would say na that was not just performative. There was really something going on there. But of course, that doesn't make Duterte a progressive Bernie Sanders. No, he's not. But I would say there was at least a pretension to, or claim to be that, and he had a degree of fluency in, let's say, the leftist Marxist analysis, right? Or at least view of life. And not to mention, he had strong views against US, against EDCA, against the liberal elite in the Philippines. So in a way, may kind of blending there, no? I mean, the critics would say parang horseshoe bang nangyari dito. I mean, you know the context. What can you clarify what went on there? Because there's so much being written about that by people from all across the world.
I think you have Duterte the mayor and Duterte the president.
I see what you're saying.
These are different creatures. Kasi kung mayor ka sa Mindanao, you can do many things, no? Yung may kalayaan ka na maging anti-establishment eh. You can be friends with the left, you know. You can be a broker during release of prisoners of war ng NPA, you know, and so kung may sundalo na huli ng NPA, siya yung magbo-broker. Pag ang NPA may pangangailangan, you know, kaya niya gawin yun kasi mayor lang.
Tactical, medyo tactical, right? Medyo tactical kasi
tactical and also I think
for maneuver.
Nasa baba pa siya ng pecking, you know, pecking order. Medyo may flexibility ka to be more progressive.
Yeah.
But once you become the president, I think there are bigger forces at play na hindi mo na magagawa yan. And Duterte used to, at the time na medyo friends pa kami, used to lament, no, na the military was always breathing down his neck. Na he's, you know, he's out on a limb by pushing for the peace process, by appointing progressives in cabinet. And tingin ko hindi lang military ang nagpe-pressure sa kanya.
The finance secretary, right?
I mean, right. His economic team was neoliberal talaga.
Exactly. Yeah.
And of course, I'm sure the US was also, you know, through the military pressuring him. Kaya yun ang pinagkaiba. And kami naman, ano kami dyan? We were very conscious of that. So nung simula, ang attitude namin, sige, engage natin. Kasi when he was mayor, ano naman eh, medyo bukas naman yan eh. Of course, may problema talaga sa how he viewed the drug war. And yan, source of ano palagi yan? Source of debate yan with him. Pero sa ibang policy, sabi namin, baka pwede, try natin. And that took around more or less a year. But by 2017, he had declared martial law in Mindanao. He had basically scuttled the peace process. And then hindi niya sinuportahan yung appointments ng mga progressives in cabinet. So you had Paeng Mariano, Judy Taguiwalo, Liza Maza, even Gina Lopez, nasibak lahat yon. So by that time, ang sabi namin, ano pa bang progressive aspect ang natitira dito sa presidente? Ito wala na kaming makita. And so that was the short-lived, what you call an alliance, you know, an informal alliance probably. Sabi ng iba, ang left daw, wala nang sinuportahan. Lahat na lang tinutulan. But if you look closely, at the start of every administration, the left would always engage.
With Arroyo.
At ang akusasyon sa amin nga, palagi ng aming mga critics, nakikipagkutsaba kayo sa ruling class. No, particularly yung mga NATDEMs daw.
Right.
Nagko-connive with the ruling class. Pero kasi in practical politics, especially at the start of each administration, there are spaces na medyo baka pwede mo i-push yung envelope eh.
Coalition politics.
And that has always been our attitude, especially pag nagbabago yung administration. Kaya nga lang, because the left has its program, we have our agenda, we have our very strong positions on certain issues. Pag naglabasan na talaga ng kulay,
Right.
we end up being in the opposite side. And naging problema nga namin dyan, particularly in Congress. Pag umabot na sa ganon, we find ourselves in the minority with people who previously binibira din namin. No? Kaya,
Oh my God.
ganon ang,
Yeah, that's
ang
like a
politics sa
zoo without
Pilipinas,
fence.
ganon eh.
Yeah. It's like back in the zoo
Oo.
without fence, diba? Yeah, I mean, I see what, yeah, kaya nga, what I'm saying is those who criticize the left for kind of being the junior partners, what it's like there's something called coalition politics, right? Otherwise, don't
Yeah.
be part of it. You have to deal with the existing state of play and then work it from there, right? While
You can be a purist. Pwede ka maging purist eh. Sabi mo, lahat kasi yan
corrupt, yeah.
corrupt, lahat yan elitista, reaksyonaryo, hindi pwede makipag-usap sa mga traditional politicians because anong mararating ng movement niyan? Anong mararating ng left? Eh di you
Good
will
for
be
your
a fringe.
ego. Yeah, it's good
You
for
will
ego,
be a
but not
fringe.
for the country.
But good for your ego, you can tell everyone we told you so.
Yeah,
Kayo kasi ayaw nyo maniwala, nagpabola kayo.
exactly.
But
Yeah.
ikaw lang yon. You're up in your ivory tower. But if you really want to engage in politics, you have to get your hands wet, no? And politics is a dirty game. Talagang mababahiran ka rin ng kontrobersya at but that's what is needed.
Right. Then kasi
Parang ikaw, palagi kang binibira na you're
Yeah,
either yellow or you're
I'm hated by not two sides, I think three sides now. I think some of your friends are angry at me. The liberals are angry at me. The Duterte people are angry at me. And then the BBM people are kind of confused with me, which brings me to the next topic, right? Because one thing I noticed that is there is a degree of convergence in the line of argument you folks like you are making against the EDCA and also President Duterte and also Amy Marcos, right? So I call this the coalition of the unwilling, right? Or let's just call it a very
I read your article. Yeah.
right? Yeah. So, and by the way, I'm saying it in a completely non-judgmental way. I'm just amused by the state of play in the Philippines. And I don't know how you see it because you're a journalist too. I'm just trying to show to the world how dynamic the Philippines is. Because ang problema ko, Ted, is when you get interviewed abroad or when they talk about the Philippines, si ganito lang, this family controls the Philippines. Like, yes and no, actually. Magulo yan sa baba, di ba? And it's not like US says this or China says this, tapos ng laban. Marami pang levels of contestation. Ours is a multi-level contested landscape. Although, unfortunately, overall, we could still say we're not in the best place where we should be. Now, going to the issue of EDCA, I think more or less, Teddy, anyone who bothers to really read my body of work, if I can put it that way in a non-pretentious way, you would know that my stance is very clear. I want the Philippines to be actually as self-reliant as possible, minimum reliance on foreign powers. I want us to be kind of a pivot state, right? That's why I talk a lot about Vietnam. I just came from Vietnam. I released multiple articles on Vietnam. And you could see, I talk about their industrial policy. Bakit yung oligarchs nila gumagawa ng global manufacturing brands? Yung oligarchs natin, nandun pa rin sa 1950s political economy, comprador bourgeois economy, as you would put it, right? At the same time, I talk about the fact that, Vietnam, whenever they meet an American official, the next week they're meeting a Chinese official, literally what happened right now. Or when Kamala Harris was going to come to Hanoi, few hours, the Prime Minister meets the Chinese envoy. The message is very clear. We're not taking sides, here. We want to have good relationship with both of you. I'm reading also this fascinating piece by a good friend of mine, a Russian good friend of mine who criticized the war in Ukraine. He's based in Berlin right now. And he said, sana Russia became na lang a pivot state, neither side with the West, nor with China, right? Because each of those two superpowers have their own interest. So even Russians, nationalists, progressives, like my friend, say Alexei, would argue that even Russia has to be careful about dealing and siding with one superpower against it, so it's one thing to talk about India or Vietnam, but even if Russian patriots and progressives also feel that way, then that makes you wonder, what's up with the Philippines? So ang premise ko kasi dito, and I think that's where we had slight disagreement, but it's not really as big disagreement as it's just, Twitter. No, my argument is this. Ang katotohanan kasi ngayon is palpak yung mga dating administrations in general. Of course, some did better than the others. in fairness naman to Aquino, at least he started revised eighth Mobilization. But overall, hindi tayo nagkaroon ng a military with even minimum deterrence capability, right? And obviously the insurgency didn't help. The second thing is, and this is where I think, Teddy, this is where I kind of have disagreements with folks on your side, or at least it's a point of emphasis perhaps, is that yes, US has done many things wrong, especially, I mean, look at the withdrawal from Afghanistan, palang the latest thing I can talk about it. You know, it's a region I'm familiar with. I've written book on the Middle East, etc., the Arab Spring. So you don't need to tell me anything about things that went wrong there, right? No thanks. I mean, I have whole things. But ang point ko kasi dito is, pagdating sa West Philippine Sea, hindi naman US yung bully eh. Diba? Or sa Taiwan, hindi naman US ang nagtathreaten sa Taiwan. So, I kind of have a discomfort level when parang the portrayal here is that we're provoking China as if China pa yung victim, diba? And I think that's where a little bit of disagreement is happening, in sense of, for me, I know what's the long-term objective, but tactically speaking, I'm not totally close to the idea that for now we have to leverage the alliances that we have. After all, Korea and Japan have even US permanent bases. Again, I'm fully uncomfortable with foreign troops on our soil. There's no way I can claim to be a patriot if I'm fully comfortable with foreigners, troops being in my country's soil. But at the same time, there is the question of the dragon breathing down our neck in the West Philippine Sea every day. And there's a question of Taiwan. So kung hintayin pa natin mag-develop ng sariling kakayan, baka wala nang matitira sa West Philippine Sea or sinugot na yung Taiwan. That's the line of argument I'm inclined towards. But then again, the reason I'm talking to you, Ted, is because I'm also arguing with myself. As Fitzgerald said, the sign of real intelligence is to be able to have competing ideas inside your mind and keep sane. So I want to hear where you're coming from, Teddy, in terms of your opposition to EDCA. Because if the EDCA is not there, the alliance with the US is not there, anong leverage natin with China? Because it's not like ASEAN also helped us a lot. I go around ASEAN. I love ASEAN, but they're completely useless to us on South China Sea. Last time I checked. So anong realistically ang dapat natin gawin to allow us to defend our claims in the best way possible without being gobbled up by the superpowers? How can we become a pivot state, as I put it, Teddy? Sorry, I threw all of that out because I just want to hear where I'm coming from, because it's easy to get misunderstood. Pro-America, anti-America, pro-China. Those labels are useless because we all love our country. The question is, which is the best way to defend our country under current existing circumstances? Yeah. And sorry, I when I say sloganeering, I didn't want to dismiss patriot. I mean, of course, we're all patriots, right? I'm just saying, beyond posting on Twitter's nice stuff, all of us, anong pwede natin gawin dito? Yeah.
Okay. So at least we agree that ang gusto natin is that there is a genuinely independent foreign policy, that we have the capability to defend our seas, particularly yung West Philippine Sea.
Right.
And that ideally, kung kaya natin by ourselves and not being dependent on one nation, particularly the United States, which is engulfed in its own conflict with China. Kasi mahahatak talaga tayo dyan. All right. So ang question lang para sa akin siguro, just to
where you're coming from, yun lang.
Given the time we have, when do we start doing that? I mean, we can always say na, kasi hindi pa natin kaya ngayon, so mag-EDCA muna tayo, but years back, when the US bases were here, the nationalist movement was already saying that hindi natin kailangan yung bases, let's develop our own armed capability out with the US bases. And the argument would always be, hindi pa natin kaya, so malaki ang pakinabang natin sa bases na yan for our security, balance in the region. And eventually, hanggat umalis na yung bases after more than 40 years,
right,
we found ourselves, hindi na na-develop yung capability natin. So, I mean, if it did not happen through all those years, how can we say now na hindi, pag sa EDCA, mamodernize din yan eventually. So, I don't accept the premise that the presence of the US troops here or their facilities automatically rebounds to the modernization and increased capability of our armed forces because it never happened in the past. I doubt it will happen.
Yeah, I
If you
agree
look
with
at
you. There's
EDCA,
nothing
alam mo naman
automatic about
kaninong
yeah, there's nothing automatic.
agenda yung EDCA. I think it's as clear as day. So ang question, di kailan natin gagawin 'yan? And I think there's no other time than now. Ngayon, what do we do with China? Alam mo yung China, that problem will not be finished in 10 years. That problem will not be finished in 20 years. I remember, nag-uusap kami nila Justice Carpio. This was during the Duterte period. And we were talking about options. Sabi ni Carpio sa amin, hindi naman natin matatapos yan even probably in our lifetime. Hindi masesettle yung 9 dash line na yan. China will always be there. But what we can and we should do is paulit-ulit in all forums, in all diplomatic assert ka lang ng assert. And I think that doon ang mas direksyon hindi yung sasakyan mo yung military build-up because never-ending yung military build-up na yan. And if pag pumutok yung issue ng Taiwan, talaga mahahatak ang Pilipinas. So I think Taiwan, I think, is a good model to emulate. Other ASEAN countries are, hindi naman sila nag-host ng mga EDCA sites. And yet, they are able to defend their waters. At least may credibility yung kanilang defense ng kanilang EEZ.
Yeah.
Yes, Indonesia even. So yun may mga pagtutularan naman natin and other countries are doing it. Bakit tayo? And babalik ako doon sa colonial history kasi ng Pilipinas. The military has always been dependent with the US. Ang laki-laki din ng interest ng US sa kanilang arms trade. Probably dito, yung malalaking deals na kasama niyan. So that prevents us from really having an independent stance when it comes to that. Even yung paglalaro sa China, on one hand, Duterte was trying to strike a balance.
I mean, that's my point. I think Duterte was too soft on
Kaya lang, masyado naman siya nagpaka...
Exactly, yeah.
And that was his flaw. So yun, ang sa akin lang, okay, di makapaglaro ka sa US, but not to the point that you would have 9 bases all over the country, not to the point that
4 of them
you will have
Taiwan
4 additional sites, in the north na malamang talagang ang target ng Taiwan. These Patriot missiles na dinisplay nila yung balikatan, sino bang magpapaputok ng Patriot missiles na yan? Di naman ang Armed Forces of the Philippines. Ang may control niyan ang mga Amerikano, and they will use that for whatever reasons
right.
they have.
Can I push
Taiwan is really the target there.
Sorry, Ted, can I push you a little bit on this? Because one argument I would make is the thing about hindi natin ma-resolve kaagad yan, so let's just be patient and have a long-term approach, is that on a daily basis yung ating mga mangingisda, on a daily basis yung ating mga resources, they're being ravaged by illegal fishing and bullying by who, right? And then of course you also have the aspect of Justice Carpio. We were together for a talk with Justice Carpio the other day, and he said yung malampaya, paubos na rin yung malampaya at hindi natin na-develop yung reed bank dahil binubuli tayo ng China since at least 2011, 2010, right? So the thing is, we cannot wait another 10, 20 years because on a daily basis, kawawa yung mga mangingisda natin. On a daily basis, kawawa yung energy security natin, food security natin. So that's why you kind of understand some people are saying maybe through EDCA, you're right, nothing is automatic, but through EDCA, baka may bargaining position ng Philippines to get the best weaponries from America and the best training possible so that we can do the fighting on our own, not to mention joint patrols, etc. I'm just trying to show to you the other side of the argument because I understand where you're coming from, but my point is that the other side of the argument is that we cannot afford to wait another 5-10 years before we have minimum deterrence. And by the way, speaking of, I'm doing, and for the sake of argument, if after the removal of permanent bases 1992 all the way to 1998 nung VFA, if in that 6 years, even under Ramos, we didn't develop our military, where do you get the confidence that the same elite that is ruling the country will take care of our defense needs if the USs are not around for the next 6, 7, 8 years. I mean, my point is like that there's a very long history of strategic incompetence by the ruling elite in the Philippines. What makes you confident? What makes you confident, right? What makes you confident that kung wala ng US sa equation, they're gonna do the right thing with vis-a-vis China?
It's not confidence. It's just that that's the way that it should be done.
Right.
Ganun naman talaga dapat. Now, let me think out of the box.
I'm just listening to you. I'm just open lang the door.
Sabi mo,
Go ahead, Ted.
All right. Sabi mo, we don't have 20 years. No, I don't think it requires 20 years for us to get more ships for the Coast Guard.
Right.
Makakabili na tayo ng barko dyan eh. Bawasan mo yung pension ng mga napakalaking pension in the billions of pesos
Pension is
of
a
the
big
retired
problem.
military person.
Yeah.
Ibili mo ng barko yan. Oh, di ba? Now, I'm a believer in social mobilization. Eh. How can we mobilize our people to protect the West Philippine Sea? Para sa akin, hindi lang papel ng military yan. So, if China has their, ano tawag nila dyan? Gray zone. Militia nila. Yeah, they have their militia. Why can't we do that? No, kahit sabihin mo mga kahoy lang yan.
But Teddy, that's dangerous. You play the game. They'll bring in their warship. The bigger warships, patay tayo dyan. Escalation.
Kaysa sa naman yung Patriot missile ng US ang ilalagay mo sa Philippine soil. If you want to defend the Philippine Sea, panindigan natin. Ang sabi ko nga, think outside the box, Bring 100 boats there, park it there. O kung dumating ang Coast Guard, let there be a standoff. Why not?
Okay yun ah.
Pakita mo na seryoso kang...
Yeah.
No, pakita mo seryoso ka sa ano.
That was actually
hindi
proposal.
Ito militia. These
that was actually proposal during Aquino.
And then, sige, and
I know what you're saying. Actually, that was a serious
proposal. Fisher folk natin, madalas mag-fluvial protest yan eh. Why not a fluvial protest in the Scarborough? That can be done. But, ayaw, sinasabihan nga ng Coast Guard natin yung mga mangingisda natin, wag na kayong pumunta kasi
magulit yan.
You have to think out of the box, I think.
I see what you're saying.
And mobilize our people. Hindi yung sa US ka na naman. Palaging Amerikano ang gusto nating lumaban for our struggles. Another out of the box thing. During the peace talks time ni Duterte. There was this talk na kung magkakaroon ng peace talks, yung fund that is used and then peace talks and then eventually there will be a ceasefire or what. Yung pondo na magagamit yan sa military operations for counterinsurgency could be channeled to external defense. At ang sabi ng kabilang side, sige, susuportahan namin yan. If ilagay natin yan, isama natin yan sa agenda ng peace talks. No, so kasi alam din naman ng kaliwa na ang China is a rising imperialist power and it's really out to get our resources.
Imperialism
magkakampi dyan ng Pilipinas.
Monopoly. Imperialism comes in all colors, literally.
Yes.
Right? That's very important. Thank you for clarifying that because I think there's a lot of misconception that people in the so-called left, right, only see the West as the hegemonic or imperialist power when in fact we know imperialism could be Russian, could be Chinese.
I mean, China's matagal ng kapitalista.
Yeah.
Pero yun nga, para sa akin, dapat mas maging creative din yung yung policy makers natin and also people in the executive. Maraming options diyan if they can just open I think their minds to out of the box ideas.
Today, just to add on this, I think I have to close this because I have an interview going on.
Yeah.
If you're patient enough, we can continue this discussion after 20 minutes or so because I want to also talk to you about the opposition, how to bring them together. I think that should be a separate episode in itself.
Mahaba yan. Mahaba.
Tell me, kailan ka pwede ulit? Let's have another conversation on that. But just on this, for me, siguro mahalaga din. In fairness, I even had Ambassador Romualdez on our podcast and also on my show, among others. And one of the things that we discuss is we have to also go beyond US in a sense that we have to also engage Japan, Australia, India, Vietnam, you know what I'm saying? In the past, Russia, but of course, Russia is now out of question. Europe, because at least itong mga middle powers na yan ay hindi hegemonic.
Middle powers,
They're
right,
not
right.
seeking military bases here, right? They want access. You know, Australia has SOFA and you know SOFA but they're not on the same plane. So for me, perhaps a good compromise would be, you know, if you don't want to rely too much on US, but you still want to get the best you can get, reach out more to Japan, reach out more to South Korea, especially because South Korea is a country just like us. They're also post-colonial. They also know what it is to be squeezed in, literally. It means so feeling good. That's also something we're not discussing enough because we always talk about the two elephants, right? There's literally another elephant. It's called India, right? Which has a lot to offer us, right? South Korea, there's Taiwan, and you're right. Taiwan also shows us that you can develop your indigenous capabilities. I think strategically there's a lot of agreement here, but I think tactically we can have a different episode because the question here is sapat ba yan? Baka it will take too long before we get everything right, and then by that time binuli na tayo ng China. But I understand also.
I think with matters of military defense, yun yung isang insidious dito sa exercises eh. Ang habol ng US dyan, interoperability. But that also requires that our technology, our war equipment material is interoperable with American. And basically, you buy their products.
Lock us in.
May lock in yan. So that also, kumikipot din yung options ng ng modernization ng armed forces. I'm sure we can get cheaper, boats probably from Korea or probably from India. Pero dahil hindi interoperable yan sa US system, edi, so pati yan, part yan, I'm sure that's part of also of the agenda of the US in these balikatan exercises. Pero again, tingin ko maraming options na pwede pang kunin ng gobyerno, but because they are too constrained with the existing policies that we have, and that is what MDT is all about, BFA, EDCA, etc., MLSA, hindi tayo makawala from the norm. And that norm has been there for the past 4 or 5 decades.
Right.
Always dependent on the US for practically our external defense.
On that note, thank you very much, Teddy Casino, former representative, longtime journalist, and lifetime activist, for sharing your thoughts.
Sociologist by training.
Sociologist and historian.
Yeah,
I wanted to add that. Yeah, sorry about that.
I graduated sociology, so practicing sociologist.
Exactly. Organic sociologist, right? No, thank you so much for that. I really appreciate it. I think, although we may not 100% agree on certain operational military issues, I think it's really a question of your concern is strategic dependency, while other people, I think their concern is strategic urgency, which is let's just scramble the best way we can to respond to China. Your concern, scrambling could reinforce the culture of strategic dependency. So I think that's the most reasonable and fair way to portray this debate, because what I hate is when we call each other by labels or name, pro-China, pro-US. No, I think we all love our
pro-China, pro-US.
Yeah, we all love our country. And I thank you so much for clarifying that, as far as you stand, imperialism is not just an American or Western thing. It can be really come from different angles. So salamat. Thank you so much, Teddy. I just realized kulang talaga sa atin. Di ba I told you? Di ba worried ka? Ang tagal naman ng isang oras. Now you realize this is nothing, no?
So take two tayo.
Take two episode soon. Let's talk about opposition. Let's talk about Philippine democracy. And let's talk about anong sense mo sa Marcos Jr. administration in general, right? So far, 1 year into his presidency. Maraming salamat again. Teddy Casino, sociologist, lifetime activist, former congressman. And let's see what else will come for you in the coming years. Hopefully the best. Maraming salamat. Talk to you.
All right. Thanks, Richard.
Salamat. It was a pleasure.